The courtroom smelled of old wood and stale coffee, a place where truth often hid behind paperwork and pride. Joseph Emory stood at the witness stand, his hands trembling just enough to notice. He was old, in his late 70s, with a face carved by time and a faded blue blazer that hung loosely on his thin frame. On his chest, pinned above his heart, a silver star gleamed faintly under the fluorescent lights. It wasn't just a medal, it was a weight, a story, a life he never spoke of. The room was packed that morning, not for the case, a dry dispute over a property line, but for him. Whispers had spread through the small town, quiet and urgent, that Joseph Emory, the man who never talked about his past, was testifying today. People came to see him, to see the Silver Star, the second highest military honor for valor, worn by someone who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Judge Harold Whitmore entered with his usual stiffness, his black robe crisp, his eyes sharp and unforgiving. He was a man who ruled his courtroom like a general, intolerant of anything that didn't fit his rigid idea of order. He sat, scanned the room, and his gaze locked on Joseph's medal. His lips tightened. The air grew heavy, as if the room itself held its breath. Joseph stood silently, his posture modest but steady, like a tree that had weathered too many storms to sway. The bailiff called his name. "Mr. Joseph Emory, please take the stand," and the crowd leaned forward, their curiosity a living thing. Joseph walked slowly, each step deliberate, his worn black shoes tapping softly on the floor. He reached the stand and faced the judge, his eyes carrying a weight that seemed to stretch back decades. Whitmore leaned forward, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Before you begin, remove that medal. This is a courtroom, not a parade." A gasp rippled through the crowd. A woman in the third row clutched her purse. A man coughed, the sound sharp in the stillness. Joseph didn't move at first. His hands stayed at his sides, the tremor in them barely visible. The judge's words hung in the air, cold and final. People shifted in their seats, some looking down, others stealing glances at the Silver Star. It wasn't just a decoration. It was a symbol of something sacred, something most in the room could only imagine. Joseph's silence wasn't defiance. It was something deeper, heavier, like the quiet before a storm. "Remove it, Mr. Emory," Whitmore repeated, his voice louder now, "or you won't speak in my court." The room froze. A young lawyer adjusted his tie nervously. An older woman in the back shook her head, her lips pressed tight. Joseph's hand moved slowly, almost painfully, to the medal. His fingers brushed the Silver Star, and for a moment, it seemed he might refuse. Then, with a care that felt like a ritual, he unpinned it and placed it on the wooden ledge beside the microphone. The metal clinked softly, a sound that echoed louder than it should have. The crowd watched, breathless, as the star lay there, stripped of its place, like a flag folded and set aside. Joseph sat, his hands folded, his eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the courtroom walls. The judge, satisfied, nodded curtly. "You may proceed," he said to the attorney, who stood quickly, papers rustling in his hands. "Mr. Emory, please state your name and occupation for the record," the attorney began, his voice unsteady. Joseph's reply came low and gravelly, each word measured. "Joseph Francis Emory, retired. Former aircraft mechanic, United States Army, 1st Cavalry Division." The attorney nodded, glancing at the judge, who sat back, his face unreadable. "And were you present at the property during the dispute?" the attorney asked. "Yes," Joseph said simply, his voice steady but quiet, like a man who had learned to say only what was needed. The questions continued, routine and procedural, about a gate, a fence, a flooded irrigation channel. But the room wasn't listening to the details. Every word Joseph spoke carried the shadow of that Silver Star, now lying lifeless on the stand. The attorney asked about the day of the dispute, and Joseph answered with precision. "I arrived at 6:30 a.m. The gate was unlocked, as always. I was meeting my neighbor, Mr. Collins, to check the runoff." The attorney pressed further. "What did you see?" Joseph's eyes didn't waver. "Two men in suits, not Collins." They were measuring the boundary with a laser. I asked what they were doing. One said I didn't have permission to be there. The crowd leaned in, sensing something beneath the surface, something more than a property line. Why did you have access to that land? The attorney asked. Joseph paused, his voice softening but clear. Because Collins gave me a key in 1989. His brother was my crew chief. He didn't come home. The words landed like a stone in still water. The attorney froze, unsure how to follow. The crowd stirred, a low murmur breaking the silence. Even the judge shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping the bench. Joseph's answer wasn't just about a gate. It was about loss, loyalty, and a promise kept across decades. The attorney cleared his throat, glancing at his notes, but the room was no longer his. It belonged to Joseph, to the medal, to the story that hadn't been told yet. The opposing lawyer stood, his suit sharp, his smile too easy. Mr. Emory, memories fade, don't they? Can you be sure of what you saw? Joseph's eyebrow lifted slightly. I remember who died under me. I don't forget those names. The lawyer's smile faltered. The crowd felt it. A shift, a crack in the room's tension. Something was coming, something bigger than the case. In the back, a figure stirred, unnoticed for now, but the air had changed. The judge, sensing the shift but unwilling to yield, leaned forward again, his voice sharp. Let's keep this to the facts. This isn't a war memorial. The words were a mistake, and everyone knew it. The Oscars, but it was too late. The courtroom felt heavier now, like the air itself carried the weight of Joseph's words. The judge's sharp comment about a war memorial stung, and people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A man in the second row leaned forward, his hands clasped tight. A woman near the back wiped her eyes, though no one could tell if it was tears or just the dry air. Joseph sat still at the witness stand, his hands folded, the silver star lying beside him like a silent witness. The opposing lawyer, young and slick, tried to regain control. He adjusted his tie, flashed another smile, and stepped closer. Mr. Emory, he said, his voice smooth but sharp, you say you had a key since 1989. That's a long time. Are you sure Mr. Collins didn't change his mind? Joseph looked at him, his eyes steady. He didn't, he said simply. We shook hands on it. That was enough. The lawyer pressed harder, his tone almost playful. A handshake? No written agreement? You expect us to believe that's binding. Joseph didn't blink. I expect you to believe a man's word. The crowd murmured, a low ripple of agreement. The lawyer's smile twitched, but he pushed on. And this crew chief, Collins' brother, how does that connect to the property? Joseph's voice stayed calm, but it carried a weight that filled the room. His brother died, saving my life. Collins trusted me because of it. That's why I had the key. The lawyer opened his mouth, then closed it. He hadn't expected that. Neither had the room. The murmur grew louder, and the judge banged his gavel. Order. Whitmore snapped, his voice tight. This isn't a history lesson. But the room wasn't listening to him anymore. People's eyes were on Joseph, on the silver star, on the story that was unfolding despite the judge's efforts to keep it contained. The attorney for Joseph's side stood again, sensing the moment. Mr. Emory, he said carefully, can you tell us more about why you were at the property that day? Joseph nodded, his voice slow but clear. Collins called me 2 days before. Said the runoff was flooding near the fence. Asked me to check it with him. When I got there, he wasn't there. Just those two men telling me I didn't belong. The attorney nodded. And what did you do? Joseph's lips pressed together, just for a moment. I told them I had a right to be there. They laughed. Said the land wasn't Collins anymore. The crowd stirred again, louder this time. A man in a worn jacket whispered to his neighbor, "That's not right." The judge's gavel came down again, harder. "Enough," Whitmore said, his face red. "We're here for facts, not feelings." But his words felt hollow. The room was slipping from his control, and he knew it. He turned to Joseph, his eyes narrowing. "You've answered the question. Step down." Joseph didn't move right away. He looked at the silver star, then at the judge, his gaze heavy but not angry. Slowly, he stood, his steps as deliberate as before. He paused by the stand, his hand hovering over the medal. He didn't pick it up. He left it there, a quiet act that felt louder than the gavel. As Joseph walked back to his seat, the room stayed silent, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It was thick, charged like the moment before lightning. People watched him sit, his hands resting in his lap, his face unreadable. The judge cleared his throat, ready to move on, but something was happening. In the far corner of the gallery, a man stood. He was tall, his posture straight, his green military uniform crisp under the lights. His chest was heavy with ribbons, and one medal stood out, a star hanging from a blue ribbon, unmistakable. The Medal of Honor. No one had noticed him before, but now I turned to him. He didn't move forward. He just stood, his hands behind his back, his face calm but firm. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and steady. "May I speak?" The words cut through the room like a blade. The judge froze, his gavel half raised. The crowd turned in unison, their breaths held. The man didn't shout, didn't need to. His voice carried a quiet authority that filled the space. Whitmore blinked, caught off guard. "This is a court of law," he said, his tone sharp but unsteady. "Unless you're counsel or subpoenaed, you have no place." The man cut him off, not rudely, but firmly. "I served 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan. I have a right to speak when a veteran is disrespected in this room." The crowd gasped, a collective sound that seemed to shake the walls. The judge's face twitched, his control slipping further. The man in uniform didn't move, but his presence grew. "I knew Joseph Emory," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "Before that medal, he wore blood. Not his own, the blood of men he saved." The room went still, so quiet you could hear a pin drop. He continued, his voice steady. "He dragged a man from a burning helicopter in Cambodia. I was there." The crowd didn't move, didn't breathe. The judge opened his mouth, but no words came. The man's eyes locked on Whitmore, not with anger, but with a truth that cut deeper. What you did today wasn't about rules. It was about power. You shamed a man who earned that star with his life. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Another man in the back stood slowly, then another. Both veterans, their faces hard but silent. They didn't speak, just stood, their presence a quiet challenge. The judge's hands shook slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "This is irregular," he muttered, but his voice was weak. The man in uniform stepped forward now, his boots echoing on the tile. He reached the witness stand, picked up the silver star, and held it carefully, like it was more than metal. "This," he said, lifting it for all to see, "is not a decoration. It's a grave marker that shines." The crowd watched, frozen, as he turned to Joseph, who sat still, his eyes fixed on the medal. The moment hung heavy, unfinished, waiting for what came next. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath, the air thick with tension that nobody dared break. The man in the military uniform stood tall, holding Joseph's silver star in his hands, his eyes steady but burning with something unspoken. Joseph sat in his chair, his face still, but his fingers tightened around each other, just enough to show the weight of the moment. The crowd was silent, but their eyes were alive, darting between the man, the medal, and Judge Whitmore, who looked smaller than ever behind his bench. The judge's face was red, his hands fumbling with his gavel, but he didn't raise it. He couldn't. The room wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the man in uniform, to Joseph, to the truth that was unfolding like a flag in the wind. The man turned to Joseph, his voice softer now, but still clear. "You didn't take this off because you wanted to," he said, holding the silver star higher. "You did it because you were told to, and that's what cuts deep." Joseph's eyes flickered, meeting the man's for the first time. Something passed between them, a silent understanding that didn't need words. The man stepped closer, his boots clicking on the floor, and held out the medal. "This belongs to you," he said. "Not on that stand, not in a case, but here." He pressed it gently into Joseph's hand. Joseph took it, his fingers closing around it slowly, like he was holding something fragile, something that could break if he wasn't careful. The crowd watched, some with tears in their eyes, others with jaws tight. A woman in a blue dress clutched her husband's arm, whispering, "He shouldn't have had to do that." A man in a flannel shirt nodded, his face hard but proud. Joseph stood then, slowly, his back straight despite his age. He didn't pin a medal back on. He just held it, his eyes locked on the man in uniform. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. They embraced, brief but strong, the kind of hug that carried years of shared pain and survival. The crowd felt it, like a wave rolling through them. A man in the back wiped his face quickly, hoping no one saw, but everyone did. The man in uniform turned to the judge, his voice calm but sharp. "You shamed a hero today, Your Honor. In front of his town, his people, his brothers. That's not justice. That's ego." The words hit like a punch. Whitmore's mouth opened, then closed. He looked around, as if searching for something to hold on to, but the room was against him now. More people stood, not in a rush, but one by one like a slow tide. Veterans mostly, some old, some younger, their faces a mix of anger and pride. They didn't clap or shout. They just stood, their silence louder than any protest. A woman in the front row, her hands trembling, stood too, though no one knew if she was a veteran or just moved by what she saw. Whitmore tried to speak. "This court will not tolerate," he started, but his voice cracked, and he stopped. The man in uniform didn't flinch. "The consequences are coming," he said simply. "Not from me, not from him." He nodded toward Joseph. "For what you did." He turned then, walking toward the exit, his steps steady, his uniform catching the light. The crowd parted for him, not out of fear but respect. As he reached the door, he paused, looked back at Joseph, and gave a small nod. Joseph returned it, just a slight tilt of his head, but it said everything. The door closed behind the man, and the room felt empty without him, like a fire had gone out. The judge banged his gavel, harder than before. "Court is recessed," he said, his voice shaky. "We'll resume after a break." But nobody moved right away. People stayed in their seats, looking at Joseph, who sat back down, the silver star still in his hand. He didn't look triumphant or angry, just tired, like a man who had carried too much for too long. The attorney shuffled papers, unsure what to do. The bailiff stood by the door, his face blank, but his eyes on Joseph. The crowd began to whisper, soft at first, then louder, as if waking from a spell. "Did you see that?" a man said to his wife. "That was something real," she replied, her voice low. Outside, the air was cool, but the crowd didn't scatter like they usually did. They stood in small groups, talking in hushed tones, their words a mix of shock and admiration. "Who was that guy?" someone asked. "Don't know," another said, but he meant every word. A few pulled out their phones, already typing, already sharing what they'd seen. The story was spreading, faster than anyone could have guessed. Inside, Joseph stayed in his seat, alone now, the medal still in his hand. He didn't look at it, just held it, his thumb brushing over its edges. The courtroom emptied slowly, but the weight of what happened stayed behind, like a mark that wouldn't fade. The judge disappeared into his chambers without a word, his face pale, his steps quick. The attorneys packed up, their voices low, as if afraid to break the spell. Joseph finally stood, slipping the silver star into his pocket. He walked out, slow and steady, the same way he'd walked in. No one stopped him, but everyone watched. The crowd outside parted as he passed, their eyes following him, some with nods, others with quiet words of thanks. He didn't respond, just kept walking, his limp more noticeable now. The day wasn't over, but something had changed, something bigger than the courtroom, bigger than the town. It was just the beginning, and everyone felt it. The sun hung low outside the courthouse, casting long shadows across the steps where people still lingered, their voices a low hum of disbelief and anger. Joseph Emory walked past them, his head down, the silver star now tucked in his pocket. He didn't look at anyone, didn't stop to hear the whispers of hero or disgrace that followed him. His old pickup truck waited in the lot, its paint chipped, its tires worn like his shoes. He climbed in, shut the door, and sat for a moment, his hands on the wheel, staring at nothing. The weight of the day pressed on him, not because of the case or the judge, but because of what had been stirred up, memories he'd kept buried for decades. He started the engine, the rumble loud in the quiet lot, and drove off, leaving the crowd to their murmurs. Back inside, the courtroom was nearly empty now, but the air still felt charged, like after a storm. The bailiff swept the floor, his movements slow, his eyes darting to the witness stand where the silver star had lain. The attorneys were gone, their briefcases packed, but they'd left behind a stack of papers that nobody cared about anymore. The property dispute, the reason for the hearing, felt small now, like a footnote to what had happened. In the judge's chambers, Harold Whitmore sat alone, his robe off, his tie loosened. He stared at the wall, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. He'd felt the room turn against him, felt the weight of those standing veterans, the man in uniform, Joseph's silence. For the first time in years, he felt small, exposed like a man who'd misjudged a fight. Outside, the crowd grew louder as news spread. A young woman, barely out of her teens, held her phone up, recording a shaky video as she described what she'd seen. The judge made him take off his medal, she said, her voice cracking. And then this soldier stood up. You should have seen it. Her video, posted online, was already spreading, shared by people who weren't even there. Others in the crowd talked in tight circles, their words heated. Whitmore's done, a man in a baseball cap said, spitting on the ground. You don't disrespect a man like that. A woman nodded, her arms crossed. That soldier, the one who spoke, he knew something. He wasn't just talking. By evening, the story had reached beyond the town. A local news van pulled up, too late to catch the moment, but eager to interview anyone who'd stayed. An older man, his jacket patched at the elbows, spoke to the reporter. Joseph Emory saved lives, he said. I knew his unit. Cambodia, 71. He doesn't talk about it, but we know. The reporter scribbled notes, her eyes wide. And the judge, she asked. The man shook his head. He messed up bad. You don't take a man's honor like that. The camera caught the courthouse in the background, its doors closed, its windows dark. The story was no longer contained. It was a spark catching fire. Back at home, Joseph sat in his small living room, the silver star on the table in front of him. The house was quiet, just the tick of a clock and the hum of an old fridge. A folded flag sat in a wooden case above the fireplace, its edges worn but clean. He didn't turn on the TV, didn't check his phone. He just sat, his hands folded, the metal glinting in the dim light. His mind wasn't on the courtroom or the judge. It was on Cambodia, on the heat, the smoke, the screams of men he couldn't save. The silver star wasn't pride to him. It was a reminder of those who didn't come home. He closed his eyes, his breath slow, and for a moment he was back there, the weight of it all pressing down again. Meanwhile, online, the story grew. The young woman's video had thousands of views now, shared by veterans groups, local forums, even a few national pages. Comments poured in, some angry, some heartbroken. This is why we fight for our heroes, one read. Shame on that judge, said another. A grainy photo, taken from the courtroom, showed the man in uniform holding the silver star, his face half blurred but his presence clear. Nobody knew his name, but people were already calling him the soldier who stood. Some said he was a Medal of Honor recipient. Others swore he was from Joseph's unit. The truth was unclear, but the image was powerful, spreading like wildfire. In town, the diner was packed that night, the usual quiet replaced by heated talk. Whitmore's been like that for years, a waitress said, pouring coffee. Thinks he's above everyone. A man at the counter, his hands rough from years of work, shook his head. Joseph's not the type to fight back. But that soldier? He said what we all wanted to. The waitress nodded, wiping the counter. I hope Whitmore feels it. He won't walk away from this. Across the room, a young man scrolled his phone, reading posts about the hearing. It's on the news now, he said, his voice low. They're calling for the judge to step down. Whitmore, alone in his house now, saw the first reports on his phone. His name was everywhere, tied to words like disgrace and shame. He turned off the screen, his hands shaking. He'd meant to keep order, to show control, but he'd misread the room, the man, the moment. He thought of Joseph's face, the way he'd looked at him, not with anger, but with something worse, disappointment. Whitmore poured a drink, his first in years, and stared out the window. The town was turning, and he could feel it. The story wasn't just about a medal or a courtroom anymore. It was about respect, about honor, about what happens when power forgets its place. And it was far from over. The next morning, the town buzzed with a restless energy, like a storm was coming, but nobody knew when it would hit. Joseph Emory woke early, as he always did, his coffee cold before he drank it. He sat in his old chair by the window, the silver star still on the table, untouched since the night before. Outside, the street was quiet, but he could feel the weight of eyes on his house. People drove by slowly, some stopping to look, others whispering his name. He didn't go out. He didn't need to. The story had taken on a life of its own, and he wanted no part of it. But it wasn't up to him anymore. The world was watching, and it wasn't just about him or the judge now. It was something bigger, something that wouldn't stay quiet. In the courthouse, the air was different. The usual hum of routine was gone, replaced by a tense hush. Clerks whispered in the halls, their eyes darting to Whitmore's empty chambers. He hadn't shown up, which was unheard of. Judge Harold Whitmore, the man who ran his court like a machine, was absent. A clerk, young and nervous, told a colleague he called in sick. Sick. In 20 years, he's never missed a day. The other shook her head, filing papers with a quick glance at the door. It's not sickness, she said. It's shame. Rumors were spreading fast. Some said Whitmore was writing a resignation, others that he was meeting with lawyers. Nobody knew the truth, but the absence felt like a confession. Outside, the news vans multiplied. Reporters stood on the courthouse steps, their cameras rolling as they interviewed anyone who'd talk. A veteran in a faded cap spoke slowly, his voice rough. Joseph Emory's a hero. Always was. What that judge did was wrong. The reporter nodded, scribbling notes. And the soldier who spoke? Any idea who he was? The veteran shook his head. Don't know his name, but I'd bet my life he was with Joseph back then. You don't stand up like that for just anyone. The reporter pushed for more, but the man walked away, his silence as firm as Joseph's had been. The cameras turned to the crowd, catching faces full of anger, pride, and something else, hope. Online, the story exploded. The grainy courtroom photo was everywhere, shared by thousands, then millions. Hashtags like hashtag Honor Joseph and hashtag Justice for Emory trended, alongside calls for Whitmore's removal. A new twist emerged. A second video surfaced, this one clearer, showing the man in uniform holding the silver star. His face was still blurred, but his voice was unmistakable, steady and sharp. This is a grave marker that shines, he'd said, and those words were quoted everywhere, on news sites, in blogs, even on a senator's social media. Then came the shock. A veterans group claimed the man was Colonel James Harrow, a Medal of Honor recipient from Afghanistan. But others swore he was someone else, someone from Joseph's past, maybe even his unit. The mystery grew, fueling the fire. In town, the diner was louder than ever, packed with people who'd never cared about a property case before. A waitress, wiping tables, overheard two men talking. I heard Whitmore's got family in the military, one said. Makes it worse, doesn't it? The other nodded, sipping his coffee. Yeah, he should have known better. You don't disrespect a man like Emory. A woman at the counter chimed in, her voice sharp. I heard the judge got a call from the governor's office last night. They're not happy. The diner buzzed with the rumor, but nobody knew if it was true. It didn't matter. The story was growing, twisting, pulling in everyone who heard it. Joseph, at home, finally turned on the radio. A local station was talking about the hearing, calling it the moment a judge lost his court. He switched it off, his jaw tight. He didn't want the attention, didn't want his past dragged into the light. But then the phone rang. It was an old friend, a man from his unit, his voice shaky. Joe, we didn't tell me you were testifying, he said. Joseph sighed. Didn't think it mattered. The friend laughed, but it was sad. It matters now. That soldier who stood up? I know him. He was with us in Cambodia. He's been looking for you. Joseph froze, his hand tight on the phone. Who? He asked, but the line went quiet. The twist hit him hard. A man from his past, a brother he hadn't seen in decades, had walked into that courtroom for him. Across town, Whitmore sat in his study, the curtains drawn. His phone was off, but he'd seen the news, the posts, the calls for his resignation. He hadn't meant for this. He'd wanted order, control, but he'd misjudged everything. A letter lay on his desk, half-written, addressed to the Judicial Conduct Board. He didn't know if he'd send it. His wife knocked softly, her voice gentle. "Harold, you need to say something. People are talking." He didn't look up. "What's there to say?" he muttered. "I was doing my job." But even he didn't believe it anymore. The weight of his mistake was crushing him, and the mystery of the soldier, whoever he was, made it worse. The town felt alive, electric with the story. People gathered at the VFW hall, swapping theories about the soldier, about Joseph, about what would happen next. A young man, barely old enough to drink, stood up at the bar, his voice loud. "I say we march to the courthouse tomorrow. Show them we stand with Joseph." The room cheered, glasses clinking. The story wasn't just news now, it was a movement. And Joseph, sitting alone in his quiet house, felt the pull of it, even as he tried to push it away. The past was catching up, and the truth, whatever it was about to break free. The morning sun crept through Joseph Emory's window, painting his small living room in soft gold. He sat in his worn chair, the silver star still on the table, catching the light. His coffee was untouched, cold now, like it always was when his mind wandered. He didn't want the attention, didn't want the town's eyes on him, but they were. The phone hadn't stopped ringing since yesterday. Friends, neighbors, even strangers. He let go to voicemail. His eyes drifted to the folded flag above the fireplace, the one he hadn't touched in years. It was his crew chief's, Colin's brother, a man who died so Joseph could live. The memory burned, sharp and heavy, and the courtroom came rushing back. The judge's voice, the soldier's words, the weight of that moment. Outside, the town was alive with talk. People gathered at the gas station, the diner, the park, their voices low but urgent. "Did you see the news?" a woman asked, pushing a stroller. "They're saying the judge might quit." Her friend nodded, sipping coffee. "He should. What he did to Joseph was wrong." The story had spread beyond the town now. National news picking it up, veterans groups sharing it, calling it a disgrace. The mystery soldier was the spark. Some swore he was Colonel Harrow. Others said he was from Joseph's unit, a ghost from Cambodia. Nobody knew for sure, but everyone wanted to. The grainy video of him holding the silver star played on repeat, his words echoing, "A grave marker that shines." Joseph's friend from a unit called again, his voice softer this time. "Joe, it's me. That soldier was Tom. Tom Ramsey. He was with us in '71. Joseph's breath caught. Tom. The name hit like a punch. He remembered him. Young, fearless, pulling Joseph from the wreckage when a helicopter went down. They hadn't spoken in decades, not since the war ended. Why didn't he say anything? Joseph asked, his voice rough. His friend sighed. He didn't want to make it about him. He saw you on the stand, saw what the judge did. He couldn't stay quiet. Joseph hung up, his hands shaking. Tom had been there, in that courtroom for him. The twist tightened in his chest. Across town, Judge Whitmore sat in his dim study, the air heavy with regret. His wife stood in the doorway, her face worried. "Harold, you need to speak out. Say you're sorry." He shook his head, his voice low. "They won't listen." He was right. The town was done with him. Online, petitions called for his resignation, signed by thousands. A senator tweeted, "Judge Whitmore, shamed a hero." He must answer for it. Whitmore's hands shook as he read the words. He meant to keep order, but he'd lost everything. His letter to the Judicial Conduct Board was finished now, but he hadn't sent it. He didn't know if he could face what came next. At the diner, the talk was louder, angrier. A veteran, his cap worn low, slammed his fist on the table. "Joseph deserves better," he said. "We all do." A young woman nodded, her phone glowing with the latest post. "They're planning a rally tomorrow," she said. "For Joseph." The room buzzed, people leaning in, planning, their voices a mix of pride and fury. Joseph didn't know about the rally, didn't know the town was ready to march for him. He just sat in his chair, the silver star in his hand now, its edges worn from years of quiet memory. He didn't want to fight, but the fight had found him. The day stretched on, the town restless. A reporter knocked on Joseph's door, but he didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence said enough. At the VFW hall, veterans gathered, swapping stories about Joseph, about the war, about the soldier who stood. Tom Ramsey once said, his voice low, "I served with him." He never talked about his medals either. The room nodded, their respect quiet but fierce. The story was growing, twisting, pulling in truths nobody expected. Joseph, alone in his house, felt it all. The past, the present, the weight of what was coming. He didn't know how it would end, but he knew it wasn't over. The town felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Joseph Emory sat in his quiet house, the silver star back on its small wooden stand under glass, where it always rested. He hadn't pinned it to his chest since the courtroom, and he wasn't sure he ever would again. The phone rang again. Another stranger, another voice wanting his story. He let it ring. Outside, his pickup truck sat under a thin layer of dust, untouched since yesterday. The world was moving fast around him, but Joseph felt stuck, caught between the past and the noise of the present. He looked at the flag above the fireplace, its folds perfect, and thought of Tom Ramsey. Tom, who'd stood up for him, who'd carried the same scars from Cambodia. The memory was heavy, like a stone in his chest. Outside, the town was anything but still. The diner was packed, the air thick with coffee and anger. "They're rallying at the courthouse tomorrow," a man said, his voice loud over the clink of dishes. "For Joseph, for all of us." A woman nodded, her eyes fierce. "Whitmore's got to go. You don't shame a man like that and walk away." The rally was growing, planned by veterans and locals who'd never met Joseph but felt his story in their bones. Posters went up, simple and handwritten, "Stand with Joseph." Social media buzzed with the hashtag Honor Joseph, and the grainy video of Tom holding the silver star had millions of views now. People shared stories of their own, veterans disrespected, heroes ignored. The story wasn't just about Joseph anymore. It was a cry for something bigger. At the courthouse, the halls were quiet, but the tension lingered. Whitmore's nameplate was still on his chambers, but nobody expected him back. A clerk whispered to another, "He's meeting with the conduct board today." They called him in. The other shook her head, filing papers. "He's done. You can't come back from this." The news vans were still outside, their cameras catching every face that passed. A reporter cornered a veteran leaving the VFW hall. "What's this rally about?" she asked. The man, his face weathered, looked at her. "It's about respect. For Joseph, for all of us who served." He walked away, leaving her scribbling. The rally was set for noon tomorrow, and the town was ready to show up. Joseph's friend called again, his voice urgent. "Joe, you got to come tomorrow. They're rallying for you." Joseph sighed, rubbing his eyes. "I didn't ask for this," he said. His friend's voice softened. "I know, but Tom will be there. He wants to see you." Joseph's heart skipped. Tom Ramsey, after all these years. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. He hung up, his hands shaking, and looked at the silver star. He remembered the fire, the smoke, Tom pulling him from the wreckage. He'd never thanked him, not properly. The thought gnawed at him, pulling him toward the rally despite himself. Whitmore, meanwhile, sat in a sterile office across town, facing 3 board members in suits. His tie was too tight, his hands sweaty. "I was maintaining decorum," he said, his voice weak. The woman across from him leaned forward, her eyes hard. "You disrespected a hero, Judge. The public won't forgive that." Whitmore looked down, his letter of resignation in his pocket, unsent. He knew they were right. The board didn't fire him, not yet, but their silence was worse. He left the meeting, his steps heavy, knowing his career was over. The town, the country, had judged him already. Back at the diner, the talk turned to Tom Ramsey. "I looked him up," a young man said, showing his phone. "He's got a Medal of Honor. Saved a whole unit in Afghanistan." Another shook his head. "No, that's not him. He was with Joseph in Cambodia. I heard it from a guy who served." The mystery deepened, adding fuel to the story. Nobody knew Tom's full story, but his words in the courtroom echoed, shared again and again. Joseph, at home, felt the pull of it all. He didn't want the spotlight, but Tom's name, the rally, the silver star, they were calling him. He stood, slow and stiff, and walked to the window. The town was waiting, and tomorrow, he'd have to face it. The morning of the rally dawned clear and sharp, the air crisp outside the courthouse. Joseph Emory stood on his porch, the silver star in his pocket, his old blazer ironed but still faded. He hadn't slept much, thinking of Tom Ramsey, the war, the courtroom. The town was already gathering, a sea of faces, veterans in caps, families with signs, kids holding flags. The diner was empty. Everyone was here. Joseph hesitated, then climbed into his pickup and drove, his heart heavy but sure. He didn't want a crowd, but he owed himself, to show up. As he parked, a cheer rose, soft at first, then loud. "Joseph," they called, and he felt the weight of their pride. The courthouse steps were packed, signs reading, "Honor Joseph," and "Respect our heroes," waving high. A veteran with a gray beard grabbed Joseph's hand. "We're with you," he said, his eyes wet. Joseph nodded, his throat tight. Then he saw him, Tom Ramsey, in civilian clothes now, no medals, just a quiet smile. They embraced, no words needed, just the grip of two men who'd seen hell together. Tom spoke first, his voice low. "I couldn't let him shame you, Joe." Joseph's eyes burned. "You didn't have to," he said. Tom shook his head. "Yes, I did." The crowd watched, silent, feeling the moment's weight. A speaker took the steps, a woman from the VFW, her voice strong. "This is for Joseph, for every veteran disrespected. We won't forget." The crowd roared, fists raised. News cameras rolled, capturing it all. Joseph stood with Tom, their silence louder than the cheers. Whitmore was gone, his resignation announced that morning, a quiet exit that felt like justice. The Judicial Conduct Board had pushed him out, the public's anger too loud to ignore. His name faded, a lesson in itself. Power without respect crumbles. Joseph and Tom slipped away as the rally grew, walking to a quiet bench. "Why'd you come, Tom?" Joseph asked. Tom looked at the sky. "Because you never forgot us. I couldn't forget you." They sat, the silver star heavy in Joseph's pocket, a reminder of sacrifice, not glory. The lesson was clear. Honor isn't in medals or robes. It's in standing for what's right, even when it's hard. The town learned it, the country felt it, and Joseph, for the first time in years, felt peace.